Happy Wednesday, everyone. Welcome to the show. I guess Wednesday, depending on where you are. It's Wednesday evening here. But thank you for joining us. We are going to do some Leviathans fiction. We're going to read a short story together, and I'm so excited. I've got some awesome people that jumped at the chance to come on and read with me, so I'm excited to share some time with you guys. We're short one. He's going to be joining us in just a few moments. But let's do a round of who everyone is so that our audience can meet you. So, Marc, who are you?
I'm Marc Follin. I'm sometimes author, sometimes freelancer, sometimes demo agent, virtual convention lead, and whatever else I can get my hands into.
Every time I see your name now, I'm like, oh, he's the guy that sets up BeakerCon.
Correct.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here.
Mhm.
Eric?
Hi, Eric Salzman. I'm the continuity director for BattleTech. I also do writing on the side, and way back when I was Fan Pro Commando Demo Agent number 8.
Wow. Wow.
So I'm old, very old.
Well, thank you for everything you do. I cannot imagine being the continuity person for something that's 40 years old. James, hi.
Hey, I'm James Kirtley. I am the XO of the minis side of the demo team. Also, like Mark, sometimes writer, sometimes freelancer, and actual convention head for several of our live shows. Um,
Awesome.
I
Thank
have
you.
not been around as long as Eric, but it's close.
That's awesome. And Wunji?
Hi, I'm Wunji Lau. I am a writer, freelancer, camo specs artist, and I do assistant development on the force packs, all those little
Awesome.
boxes of miniatures.
I'm glad that you said that because it makes me feel less bad. Like 2 years ago, I've been here almost 2 years, guys, and I remember being like, "What is a force pack? What is?"
There is so much stuff in this franchise, isn't there?
Well, and it's funny because I got to have a call earlier this week and for a potential movie that wants it has a scene with a comic book store, and so they wanted some like games and stuff. So they were asking if they could like borrow some merch from us for a while, um, and so they were like, "Could you send us like 3 to 6 of every force pack you have?" And I was like, "Oh, you don't understand what that means."
Oh, sweet summer child.
Yes. So I've come a long way. Well, we are waiting on one more. We're waiting on the BattleTech assistant line dev, Aaron Cahall, who's just getting back um, from basketball practice with his kiddo. So he'll be joining us in just a second. But we're going to be reading A Monster in the Sky by Stephen Mohan. Does anybody know Steve? Mohan Jr. We're gonna go with Mohan. Um, and have any of you guys contributed to Leviathans in any way?
I had to
Have
beg
not.
off.
You had to beg off.
I had so much stuff to do in BattleTech.
Fair, fair.
And
Uh,
giant robots. I mean, I had to make a choice. Giant robots or, floaty dirigibles. Come on.
I'm kind of excited. This is my first foray into the fiction. So Leviathans is not something I would have picked up on my own. So now having seen the gameplay and stuff like that, like starting to dabble and see how much this can capture and like, is this the moment of the new fandom kind of thing? Because I don't know if you guys know, I don't know myself very well. So I've periodically been like, that sounds stupid, and then I become obsessed with it, like Shadowrun. So so my first impressions are never the right ones. But great. So we're gonna be oh hey Jason. Jason Hansa's joining us in chat. Oh Big Red, thanks for saying that for Steve. I'm excited to do more of this. We were talking a little bit before coming live here. I'm vamping until Aaron gets here. We were talking a little bit about like doing something like this more regularly or frequently, and we've got some cool stuff coming up with the new website. We announced a new website that's coming, and that's going to allow for some affiliate programs and sponsorships and stuff like that with content creators. Because the reality of it is, like, producing is a lot of work and a lot of time, and you need to have a tech, and who's going to assemble all the schedules, and who's going to get all the content. Is there going to be any editing involved? Who needs to build an overlay? I built this today in like an hour. So like there's a lot of time behind the scenes that goes into this. So I'm hoping to find some eager producers that want to come create content on our channel. So hey, Aaron. Perfect timing. I was stalling until you joined us. Oh, cannot hear you though.
Right now?
Yeah. Awesome. Aaron, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Aaron Cahall. I'm the BattleTech Assistant Line Developer.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for being here. We're going to get into some levs. So this is going to be very informal. Just to let our audience know, we're going to assign rotate narrators so everyone gets a chance to read, because there may be dialogue that doesn't have enough characters to feature everyone, or at least feature them a lot. So we'll assign dialogue and characters through the dialogue as it comes up, but as we go, there are nice little chapter breaks here. So we'll decide when we're going to switch off based on how long we've gone on here. So don't worry, it's all very informal. But let's get started. Does anyone want to read first? I think we talked about Eric because all the Russian names.
Хорошо.
I can do it. I can do it. Anyone.
Awesome. Take it away whenever you're ready.
The bowl of the sky was lavender with the dying night. Polkovnik Mikhail Kozlov's mighty vessel rocked gently at tether. A lifelong mariner, Kozlov handled the ship's easy roll without thinking of it. His mind was on other things. On this morning, the morning of 18 October 1896, the Tsar's proudest ships were moving to break the Japanese stranglehold on Vladivostok. Even now, the sleek, powerful hulls of the Baltic Fleet were slicing through the blue waters of the Korean Strait on their way to punish the Imperial Japanese Navy. And here was Kozlov, wearing a strange uniform with a strange rank, commander of a sky ship, a vessel of so little importance that Admiral Rozhesvensky had decided to order out the Sky Fleet in support of his grand ships. Here he was, the Polkovnik, in command of the RVS Prince Baratynsky, and he could do nothing. He shook his head. Polkovnik. A polkovnik was something like a colonel. Whenever Kozlov heard the title, he thought captain. Kozlov laid a hand on the bulk of turret Adine. The forward turret housed two massive 8-inch guns. If only he had a chance to show. But no. Kozlov inhaled a deep breath of cold air. The sky ships had their uses. They could spot, and they could harass infantry, but the Battle of Port Arthur proved that 3- and 5-inch guns were no match for the Japanese fleet's heavy weaponry. Would his unproven 8-inchers really fare any better against the Japanese 12-inch guns and 9-inch thick Krupp armor? He lifted his hand from the turret's flank, his palm suddenly cold from the steel. All around his vessel, the fleet hung at tether, Baratynsky's mate Alexander Nevsky, and a score of Berkuts, the skyship equivalent of gunboats. They hovered 100 feet above the earth, moored by great manila hawsers. They looked like balloons, their hulls painted a pale blue. The Cossacks of the sky, General Arden Tomov called them. Kozlov had never seen anything so ridiculous in his whole life, nor anything so magnificent. He sighed and looked up, watching dawn break gold and yellow across the eastern sky. If he avoided looking out the railing, he could convince himself that he was aboard a ship at sea. He felt the rumble of machinery through the deck, the chill morning wind tearing at his coat, the motion of a vessel battling the will of the world. There had been a time when he'd thought these things were enough. He'd forsaken a promising naval career to sail the sky, but now he missed the cold spray and the taste of salt, missed the glory of serving the Rodina, the motherland, in the way that mattered. Kozlov's mouth tasted dry. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the brightening sky. An urgent, muffled call emerged from a nearby voice tube, jerking him out of his reverie. Polkovnik, to the bridge. Kozlov flew up the steel ladder that led to the port bridge wing, his mind racing. On a naval vessel, this word was passed only in case of collision, casualty, or enemy action. Kozlov couldn't imagine what emergency demanded his presence on the bridge. He ran, his heart pounding in the cage of his chest. He burst onto the bridge, throwing open the hatch so that it slammed against the steel bulkhead. One officer and one non-com stood bridge watch while at tether, a junior sergeant at the wheel and the lieutenant, Niet, Poruchik, the rank was Poruchik. At the compass stand, the lee helm and the chart table were unmanned. The compass stand set all the way forward, just below the great windows that looked out on the world. The Poruchik, in his long black leather coat over green trousers and high-browned boots, Golubev was his name, was bathed in the dawn's glow, and yet his face was ghastly pale, his jaw hung slackly open, his eyes lost. Kozlov had seen such a look only once before, when he'd been a junior lieutenant aboard the battleship Retvizan. One of his young seamen had been washed over the side in heavy seas. Kozlov had seen the very same look of despair and shock on the face of that boy's mother.
Who wants to be Kozlov?
Shouted. Oh, sorry.
Let's assign our Kozlov. Who's going to be our Kozlov?
I'll do it.
Awesome, James.
What is it?
He shouted. Golubev handed him a slip of paper, a telegraphic message. Kozlov knew with one look that it came from Azrael Rozhesvensky, the fleet. Present location, or each, let me know when we're switching. Present location, Korean, Strait, 8 miles north-northwest, Tsushima Island. Japanese have crossed my T. Kozlov's gut clenched. Crossing the T was an ancient naval tactic, allowing a fleet to bring all its guns to bear while its opponent was restricted to forward guns only. It was a sure recipe for disaster. The message listed the fleet's losses: 2 battleships, a pair of cruisers, and 4 destroyers. So far. Kozlov wanted to stop reading, wanted the terrible roll call to end, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. He stood there, frozen. Request immediate assistance. The urgency, the panic in the message was clear as daylight. Kozlov turned to the junior sergeant at the wheel.
All hands to battle stations.
Who's going to play Sergeant?
Sure.
Mark.
All hands to battle stations. Yes, sir.
Snapped the sergeant. He turned and pulled the bell behind him, filling the bridge with a rapid ringing that carried throughout the ship by a network of tubes. Kozlov pointed at Golubev.
Make preparations to get underway.
The young officer blinked.
Who's going to be our Golubev?
Okay.
Aaron.
Sir.
He opened his mouth, closed it again.
Sir, we don't have orders.
You do!
Kozlov roared, and then under his breath,
soon we will as well.
Kozlov wrote out a quick message for his telegraphic operator. He addressed it to General Ardon Tomov, father of the Cossacks of the Sky, making preparations to get underway. We'll take Sky Fleet to Tsushima Island to assist Baltic Fleet. He handed the slip of paper to the watch messenger, then told Golubev to signal the fleet his intentions. Then he stepped back, standing in the center of the tumult, while his watchstanders took their stations, shouting clipped reports to the deck officer. And then silence came again to his bridge. A stray tendril of smoke found its way to him, smelling the fires of hell. Engineering was bringing up the standby boilers. Somewhere below deck, stokers were feeding the fires at Boratinsky's heart, sweat gleaming on their bare backs. The messenger returned with another message. Baltic Fleet must be saved at all costs. Which was clear enough. Kozlov was to trade the vessels of the Sky Fleet, all of them if he had to, in exchange for the Baltic Fleet's escape.
Yes, sir.
He said crisply. Godspeed, Misha, Gen Tomov sends. The deck officer came to attention as Kozlov looked up. I think that's new.
I think it's Golubev. That's Golubev, I think.
It's Golubev.
Yep.
Okay. And who's Golubev?
Aaron.
Is it? Lines are singled up, sir. Standing by engines. Deckhands are standing by to take up lines.
Very well, Mr. Golubev. Take up lines.
Take up lines, yes, sir.
Young Poruchik repeated the order into the brass voice tube, and the order would be repeated through a megaphone to the men on the ground. Somewhere below them, young ground conscripts were prying manila lines loose from bollards with marlin spikes. Men on the skyship's deck were rapidly hauling up the heavy mooring hawsers hand over hand. A voice sounded in the brass tube.
Mark, be the voice.
All right. All lines taken up, sir.
Very well, deck officer.
Kozlov turned to the petty officer, Niet, the junior sergeant at the lee helm.
Ahead slow.
A few seconds passed, and then Kozlov heard the distant buzz of the propellers coming up to speed, great blades enclosed in aluminum cowlings beating the sky. Kozlov pointed at the man who was the watch's lead sergeant.
One long blast.
The sergeant pulled a lever, and the ship's horn sounded for precisely 3 seconds, drowning out all of her noise, and warning the assembled company that the Prince Boratinsky was underway. And then Kozlov's skyship, his unimportant skyship, began to move through the newly born sky.
All right. Thank you. Dang, Eric, that was awesome. All right, so the only person that didn't get to do some voice dialogue in that chapter was Wunji. So let's, Wunji, why don't you take the next section?
Okay, sounds good. The black smoke of battle stung Togo Heihachiro's eyes, burned them, clawed at them, until tears streamed down his cheeks, and he had to lower the heavy binoculars that made his old hands ache and wipe away the tears with his dark blue sleeve. His ears, his head, rang with the constant report of the Mikasa's forward pair of 12-inch 40 caliber guns. He smelled the stink of battle, steam and burning coal, the bittersweet odor of spent explosives, and because the Russian flagship, Knyaz Suvorov, had managed to land several blows with her own 12-inch guns, the coppery stink of spilled blood. It was glorious, all of it. He stood on the Mikasa's topgallant forecastle, above the battleship's boxy bridge. His station was the compass stand, where he could monitor the ship's heading and pass orders down to the captain through the twin voice tubes. But the real advantage of his station was that he could see everything. See everything. Behind him, the ship's 2 stacks belched smoke and steam into the blue sky, and the sea was a royal turquoise. 3 capital ships steamed in a neat line behind him, the 4 battleships, the beating heart of his fleet. Officers clustered all around him, dressed in dark blue, wearing gold aiguillettes draped across their shoulders to mark them as his aides, as they bustled about their duties. But what really commanded Togo's attention was the signal flag overhead, rippling and flapping in the gale of the Mikasa's flank bell. The flag was a square, built from 4 triangles, 1 black, 1 yellow, 1 blue, and 1 red, the apex of each meeting in the flag's center, what the English called the Z flag. Today, Togo was using it to send a special message to his fleet.
Who's our
The Empire's
Togo?
fate.
Who's going to be our Togo? Let's go with Marc. Marc didn't get many lines last time.
All right. The Empire's fate depends on the result of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty.
And his men and ships were doing their duty. This is all. Oh, actually, is that Togo?
It's not in quotes, but
This is almost over. He raised the binoculars to his eyes. The Russians were running flat out, for all the good it would do them. Their remaining battleships and cruisers holding their battle line, torpedo boats and destroyers screening the capital ship's port and starboard quarters. Toho ignored the smaller vessels, intently watching the battleships. There, he saw a slight jog in the white wake that stretched out from the lead vessel's wake.
Suvorov showing starboard aspect.
He called out.
who's going to be Taniguchi? Let's do Eric.
Enemies turning due west.
Agreed Taniguchi Shintaro, Togo's flag lieutenant.
It looks like a turn together.
The boy was right. The Russians weren't turning in sequence. They had all turned at once, which meant they weren't holding their battle line. They spread out before him, running west, fleeing at best possible speed to the safety of their base at Port Arthur. They were not going to make it.
We can cross their T again,
Said Taniguchi eagerly. Togo's fleet was capable of 16 knots. The Baltic fleet, its hulls fouled and its machinery taxed by the long journey to the Pacific, was capable of perhaps 9 or 10. The admiral had used his advantage in speed and maneuverability to cross the Russians' T twice, with devastating results. While he could smash the Russian vessels with full broadsides, they could only answer with their forward turrets. That tactic, combined with superior Japanese gunnery, had taken a toll. If Togo executed the maneuver again, he could send perhaps a third of the remaining Russian ships to the bottom. But for his entire battle force to pass along the T and then turn back to pursue would take perhaps 45 minutes. At 10 knots, the surviving Russians would gain almost 7 nautical miles, 14,000 yards. He could send a third of them to the bottom, but he wanted them all.
Yeah.
Togo barked. He was silent for a long moment, vectors and times and speeds spinning in his head. When he spoke, There was steel in his voice.
We will turn in sequence in 8 minutes to new course 261. Verify my calculations and then haul up the signal flags.
Hey, Admiral Sama.
Taniguchi barked. Togo had just committed his fleet to a flat-out run, followed by a ship-to-ship battle at close range. It was a brutal decision, but looking at the Russian vessels, he could make no other. He would have them all. And then a lookout called.
Aaron.
Leviathans, west-northwest.
Togo dropped his binoculars and turned to look where the boy was pointing. He saw a cloud of the small gunboats the Russians called Berkuts, and 2 of the bigger vessels, the RVS Alexander Nevsky and a second vessel that looked like it might be the Nevsky's sister. He felt a flutter of unease in his stomach. No commander liked the words "might be."
Aaron, keep with the flag navigator.
Maneuvering calculations place us on an intercept course if we turn to
The flag navigator looked up.
258.
Togo heard the awe in the young man's voice and allowed himself a small smile. He had been off by 3 degrees. He had eyeballed the enemy's course and speed, and his calculation had been off by only 3 degrees.
Raise the signal flags.
Said Togo.
Turn in sequence to 258.
I said a signal off. Oh, sorry. Aye.
Said his signal officer.
Raise the signal flags. Turn in sequence to 258.
Taniguchi stepped to his side and pitched his voice so only the admiral could hear him.
Admiral.
The boy hesitated.
Out with it, Lieutenant.
Said Togo evenly.
Sir, perhaps we should reconsider the pursuit, the Leviathans.
The admiral snorted.
Get hold of yourself, Taniguchi-san. The skyships are toys. This is the age of the gun, and their weight restrictions guarantee that the Leviathans will never match our firepower.
Hi, Admiral Togo-sama.
Said the boy uneasily.
We will smash the Russian fleet and the world's interest in Leviathans all in one instant.
Togo's eyes found the Z flag.
And Japan will rule the East.
This time, the boy's answer wasn't hesitant.
Hey!
Sir,
Called out the navigator.
recommend you mark the turn in 10 seconds.
He held up a gold pocket watch so the admiral could see the sweep of its second hand. When it hit 12, Togo leaned over the voice tube.
Captain, come to new course 258.
Come to new course 258. Yes, sir.
Came the reply. Behind him, the flag signal officer was hauling down the tactical signal, ordering the fleet to execute the order. As each of his battleships and cruisers came to the point in the ocean where the Mikasa had turned, they would follow the flagship right. In that moment, the die was cast, the fate of the Russians sealed. And then Togo looked up. The Leviathans had organized themselves into a long line abreast across his intended course. The 2 great ships in the center, 10 or 11 gunboats on either side, stretching out like the wings of some great and terrible bird. The Russians hovered only 100 feet off the water, a skirmish line set between Togo and his prey. Togo studied the vessel he did not know, sister to the Nevsky, the size of a naval destroyer or a light cruiser. Her bow, massive and blunt over a forward-sloping skirt. Her bridge was set in a tower behind her forward gun turret, and her guns. This was supposed to be a sister to the Nevsky, but were those bigger guns? Togo watched the vessel as his battleship swept toward her at 16 knots. Watching it hovering in the sky, finding the sight as fantastic as ever. 5,000 or 6,000 tons of steel and coal, and guns and men floating in the air as light as a soap bubble, casting its dark shadow on the blue, blue sea. It was an abomination. It was a monster in the sky. Togo was going to destroy it, was going to destroy them all, today and for always. These playthings had no place in the honorable affairs of men. And again, Admiral Togo Heihachiro felt that light flutter of unease in his stomach. Nothing more than unease.
Awesome. Good job, Wunji.
No,
You guys are good at this. All right, we're back to Kozlov, so we're gonna need James to do that dialogue. So let's have Mark do some narration.
All right. Kozlov stepped to the port bridge wing. He wanted to see the Japanese coming with his own eyes, unfiltered by glass. It was dangerous on a skyship's deck when underway, buffeted by heaven's angry winds, and Kozlov had published a standing order that required all officers and ratings to clip their safety lanyard to the steel pad eyes bolted to the ship's superstructure when outside. But this was war. Speed was important, and more was at stake than Kozlov's meager life. As he watched, the Japanese flagship Mikasa fired. Simultaneous with his turn, his forward guns belched, billowing flame, molten orange and yellow mixed with tendrils of sulphurous black, pumping out of a pressure impulse so powerful that it churned the cobalt water white. For a moment, the sea next to the Mikasa's hull was hollowed out before it came rushing back in to reclaim what it had lost. A second later, the sound came to Kozlov, the crack of a close lightning strike. So close you can feel the hair rise on your body and you jump, even as everything around you rattles and shakes with a terrible blow. Holy God. So these were the Japanese guns. And if the guns were terrible, the gunners were even more fearsome. As Kozlov watched, white water geysered a scant 25 yards astern of a fleeing Russian destroyer. A near miss, fired at range, by a ship moving at flank speed in the middle of a turn. The Mikasa's gun spoke again, sooner than he would have thought possible, and this time there was no escape for the doomed destroyer. One moment the little ship was sprinting for his life, and the next, the twin shells smashed into the little ship dead astern, instantly sending up a column of spray and orange fire and debris and men. A terrible palsy rippled the destroyer's hull. He suddenly veered starboard and then stopped. Kozlov could not swallow. Steering casualty. The little ship was not under command. The last hit had robbed him of the ability to flee. Kozlov had grown up in the Novosibirsk in Asian Russia. As a boy, he'd hunted deer with his father in the dark Siberian forest. On one such trip, he'd somehow managed to become separated from his father. He trudged through an early spring snow, cold, miserable, lost, and the dead weight of his old rifle cradled in his arms. Suddenly, he looked up and saw a deer. It was a big doe, maybe 120, 130 pounds. Tawny coat, ears pricked, nose twitching. Liquid brown eyes looked right into his. Young Misha knew he should shoot the deer, but he was only 8 and not yet used to killing things. He didn't know why the doe didn't flee. For a time, long time, the two of them stood there unmoving, staring at one another. And then, an orange and black terror erupted from a thicket not 6 feet from where Misha stood. The tiger launched itself into the air, expending all the power stored in its legs in one leap. Its jump missed the doe, but the animal still landed a blow at the last second that broke the deer's right hind leg. The creature tried to drag itself away, bleeding with pain, barely moving, still fleeing, because that's what its instincts told it to do. The tiger didn't even bother to run. It loped after the deer, brought it down, ate it alive. That was exactly what was going to happen to the destroyer. As Kozlov watched, the Japanese battleship fired again, this time hitting amidships. It took less than a minute for the little destroyer to slip completely beneath the waves. Kozlov turned and stepped back into the bridge. He did not act. The fleet's fate would be the same as the destroyers. In addition to their devastating advantages in gunnery and armor, the Japanese were much, much faster than their counterparts. The Japanese battle line would stab through the center of the Russian formation like blade, battleships and cruisers firing with ring broadsides until no targets remained. The Baltic fleet would never reach the shelter of Port Arthur's shore batteries, unless the sky ships could slow the Japanese. Kozlov turned to his deck officer.
Pass the signal to all ships. Target the lead Japanese battleship and fire.
Okay, I gotta just say, Mark, like, next time I have insomnia, I want you to read me a story. Like, you have the calmest voice. Amazing. Love it. I think what we'll do for the next few rounds, because since you're Togo and James is Kozlov, let's have you guys switch off when you're reading each other's scenes. So James, you'll go next, and then we'll switch back to Mark for a bit, back and forth.
Togo looked up at the line of warships hovering over the sea, not more than 4,000 or 5,000 yards from his position. He did not like having the enemy above his head, but then they'd been there before, hadn't they? Off the coast of Port Arthur, the Russian Leviathans had tried to turn the tide and failed. Oh, they had damaged ship superstructures and they'd killed some of his ratings, and they'd plagued the Japanese infantry, earning the name Ryuhaha Thunder Dragons. But those accomplishments were not the same as punching through the Imperial Navy's fine Krupp armor. And if a ship's armor could not be breached, she could not be sunk. Suddenly the Leviathan's guns erupted into orange flame. Togo stood firm. If today was his day to die, he would face it like a man. For a moment, the air was filled with the whistle of falling shells, and then the sea erupted in towering fountains of white water, drenching the men standing behind him. He heard their startled gasps. Togo remained impassive. He watched. The Leviathans were firing at range, their 3- and 5-inch guns barely able to reach the Mikasa with any kind of accuracy. The enemy could do very little to hurt him, but the reverse was not true. Togo leaned toward the voice tube.
Captain, come to new course 348.
His battle line was steaming directly for the Leviathan line, like a spear thrust at a shield. By turning 90 degrees, he was presenting his port side to the enemy, but sacrificing his pursuit of the fleeing Baltic fleet. Togo turned to his signal officer.
Signal all ships, continue pursuit of enemy.
The officer bowed.
Aye. All ships, continue pursuit of enemy.
Strictly speaking, the order wasn't necessary, but Togo wanted to be absolutely sure that his battle line did not follow him into the turn. His main force would continue its pursuit of the Baltic fleet, and the Mikasa's heavy guns would smash the Leviathans from the sky. A grim smile touched Togo's lips as he gave the next order.
Captain, redirect fire at the line of Leviathans. All port batteries, you may fire at your leisure.
Back to you, Mark.
All right. Kozlov allowed a smile to touch his lips as he watched the Mikasa turn. The Japanese are taking the bait. He is drawing them off their pursuit. And then the smile froze. The second battleship did not turn. He watched the golden chrysanthemum on the warship's bow, the emblem of the Japanese emperor, waited for it to slide right. But the second battleship never wavered, nor did his 2 brothers behind him. All 3 battleships knifed straight through the water and past their flagship, which was slowing and steadying on a new course. The main Japanese battle line would not be drawn off. They were going straight for the Baltic fleet, while the Mikasa dealt with the skyships alone. Could do it too. Kozlov had 22 Berkut gunships and 2 Nevsky-class cruisers, but the Mikasa's port side bristled with guns. 7 6-inch 40 calibers, 5 3-inchers, and of course, the monsters. Quartet of Ellswick 12-inch 40 caliber heavy guns. More than enough firepower to knock his little fleet out of the sky. And as Kozlov watched, the great ship's guns elevated, his superior gunners taking aim.
James.
The Mikasa's guns opened up with the fury of hell itself. For a moment there was nothing, and then the sea exploded a few hundred yards in front of the Leviathan's shadows. Too high, Togo thought. The gunners have trained their guns too high. His fleet had the best gunners afloat. They would determine their error. The admiral stood stock still, enemy shells raining down all around his ship, drawing closer. The Russian fire drawing closer. An enemy shell hit amidships, the dull clank of the impact rising in the cold air. Billowing smoke and flame blossomed from the port side. Then there was another hit, and another. One of the enemy gunners had found the Mikasa's range at last. Clank, clank, clank. Now the enemy shells were pounding his hull like a hard rain. Togo drew a deep breath and ran to the ladder, climbed down, ignoring the shouts of his aides who must have thought he'd gone mad. He climbed quickly, past the bridge, hand over hand, jumping the last 4 feet to the wood deck and landing in a crouch. Ignoring the flash of the enemy's fire, he ran to the side of his ship and peered over the safety railing. The black of burned paint and spent explosives streaked the gray hull. There were ugly dents all along the port side where the armor was beginning to buckle, but the 9-inch plates had not been pierced. The Krupp armor had withstood the full fury of the enemy's assault, which meant the Mikasa could not be defeated. Togo stood, satisfied to return to the forecastle. As he turned, he saw the Mikasa's forward 12-inch guns lower a few degrees. And then they spoke. He turned back just in time to see the massive shells hit. One moment he was looking at a Berkut gunship, maybe a third the size of the Nevsky and her sister, and then suddenly the sky was filled with fire. It started just behind the Leviathan's main guns. An explosion, orange flame leaping 20 feet into the air, debris raining into the ocean. And then there was a second explosion, a massive whoomp that seemed to rattle the world. Secondary explosion, Togo thought. Forward magazine. All at once the sky was gray and hazy with debris, cinders glowing bright orange and jagged pieces of wooden paneling and long, uncoiling lengths of rope, and a million fluttering pieces of paper like a flock of geese startled into the air by a gunshot. And bodies. Some still and falling with a dead man's weight, some screaming, some burning, no more than a black silhouette against the flames devouring their flesh as they plummeted towards the sea. The ship itself, broken and burning, spiraled out of the air as electroid leaked from its hull. All this Togo saw in an instant, before the next blast from the Mikasa's guns.
Ooh.
Me again?
Mm-hmm.
All right. One moment Kozlov was standing there, watching the fleet's gunners find their range, shells starting to smash into the battleship's hull. Given a few more seconds, the Boratinsky's gunners would find the right angle, and his 8-inchers would. God's hand reached down and grabbed Kozlov, hurling him across the bridge and smashing him against the starboard bulkhead. The Polkovnik lay there for a moment, stunned. He had the impression that there had been a huge noise, but in fact there was silence, total silence, and for a second he thought he might be dead. He looked up and saw one of his junior sergeants standing over him, the left side of his face masked in dark blood from the gash just over his left eye. The man was screaming at him, his mouth wide open, muscles standing out like cords in his neck, but Kozlov could barely hear. He touched his right ear. His hand came away stained crimson. Kozlov scrambled to his feet. He were dead. He must be in hell. The glass in the forward windows had shattered, and the blue tiled deck was littered with thousands of green shards of glass, streaked with blood. One of his men, young Golubev, lay on the deck. Kozlov crouched by the poruchik's still form, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. The boy was dead. The polkovnik stood, trying to understand what had happened. He looked out the opening on the port side of his bridge, and that had once contained glass, and what he saw was one of his gunships sinking through the air. The little vessel had taken position directly outboard the Boratinsky, no more than 300 yards off the cruiser's port beam. Now it was a collection of twisted and burning wreckage. The main gun turret was gone, just gone, and the deck after where it should have been was blackened and burning. The scorched steel had opened up like a blooming flower.
Secondary explosion.
Kozlov whispered. The terrible explosion had also taken the ship's pilot house. As Kozlov watched, the vessel heeled over. Berkuts carried 2 electroid spheres along their keels. The forward sphere must have been destroyed in the explosion, releasing electroid, with it losing the positive buoyancy needed to keep the gunship's corpse in the sky. With its rear sphere still intact, but its forward sphere crushed, the vessel fell forward the sea bow first, like a sinking ship plunging toward the ocean floor. Kozlov's hopes fell with the breeze. This was the worst possible outcome. Sacrificing his skyships, but there was no chance of slowing the main Japanese force. He would lose his men and his ships and the Baltic fleet. Kozlov turned and met the eyes of the junior sergeant whose face was a half mask of blood.
Can
That's
you
also
hear
me.
me? Oh, sorry.
He shouted. I was going to say, I think that's also me, but we're good.
Oh.
He shouted. He couldn't hear himself, but the sergeant nodded vigorously.
Good.
Said Kozlov.
Signal the fleet. All sky ships break formation. Withdraw. Attack the main body of the Japanese fleet. Commanders select targets at will. Just slow them down. Slow them down.
Back to you, James.
Now I guess that's me. From his perch on the topgallant forecastle, Togo watched the Russian Leviathans break and run. It was a glorious rout, and he wished the whole world could see it, a fleet of sky ships beaten by a single battleship. And then he saw that it wasn't quite a rout. The Russian vessels were withdrawing, but they were withdrawing in good order, and they were running toward his fleet. Togo's eyes narrowed. The Russian commander must be mad. Beaten by a single battleship, the man now chose to engage a fleet of cruisers and battleships? No matter. Some men demonstrated difficulty in learning the realities of the world. If it was his fate to instruct them, so be it. He turned to Taniguchi.
Signal the cruisers, Kasuga and Nishin, to retrain their guns on the Leviathans. All other vessels are to concentrate their fire on the Baltic fleet.
His aide ducked his head.
Hi, Togo-sama.
This was one fight Togo didn't intend to miss. He gave new orders.
Captain, left full rudder, come to a new course, 249. All ahead flank. It is time for the Mikasa to rejoin her fleet.
Awesome. All right, let's hand it over to Aaron for some narration.
Wind tore at Kozlov's clothes, buffeted his body, assaulted his face, until tears streamed from his eyes and were carried away. Polkovnik wrapped an arm around the center framing of his shattered windows, holding himself up against the wind, against the treacherously blood-slicked deck, against the nausea roiling his stomach, and the ice-pick agony throbbing in his ears.
Fire!
Kozlov roared. The Baratinsky shook with the recoil of his 8-inchers. Water exploded on the far side of the Japanese destroyer.
Bracketed!
Kozlov called out. The last shot had been on the destroyer's near side. His gunners had found their range. Knowing he was doomed, the destroyer turned hard to starboard at 30 knots, kicking up a rooster tail of white spray. The little ship's principal weapons were his twin 18-inch torpedo tubes, but he made a brave noise with his 3-incher. A gray line of shells rose from the sea and shot into the sky only a score of yards from where Kozlov stood.
Steady helm,
He barked.
I don't want the ship to move an inch.
The junior sergeant on the helm said something, but Kozlov couldn't distinguish the words. He had gone from hearing nothing to hearing muffled sounds. It was like overhearing a conversation through a closed door. It wasn't much, but he would take what he could get. He looked at his bridge crew. They looked back at him, faces naked with fear, wanting desperately for him to somehow make it all okay.
Don't worry about that little 3-inchers, boys.
He said.
He's trying to run, which means he can't bring his gun all the way around, and he's firing on the move. His problem's much harder than ours, so we're going to wait right here until our gunners find his range.
His boys all nodded. Kozlov imagined he heard a few yes sirs. And then suddenly they were all pointing, their mouths open in silent yells, jumping up and down and pounding each other on the back. Kozlov turned in time to see a great gout of flame stab high into the sky. The Baratinsky's 8-inch shells had punched through the destroyer's armor. The destroyer's stern was down by at least 10 feet and listing heavily to port. But that wasn't what caught Kozlov's attention. Its fourth stack was damaged, exploded like a joke cigar. Heavy black smoke poured from the mangled stack. In a flash of insight, Kozlov understood what had happened. One of the shells must have dropped straight down the stack, destroying the last of the 4 Yarrow boilers, unobstructed by armor. and the Baratinsky had been so high that the destroyer couldn't reach up to hit him. Why didn't I see it before? Thought Kozlov. In warfare, it's always been advantageous to hold the high ground, and what ground is higher than the sky? He stepped through the hole of the missing window onto the port bridge wing to take a new look at the battle raging all around him. Skyships lumbered through the heavens, trying to avoid the more powerful Japanese gunfire. The battle had devolved into 20, 30 skirmishes. The Russians seemed to be losing them all. But it didn't have to be that way. Suddenly, his replacement deck officer was by his side, pulling him back inside the pilot house. The boy was pointing frantically out the windows. Kozlov saw the damaged Japanese destroyer limping away, trailing ugly black smoke. He thought he heard the boy say, "Pursue." Kozlov shook his head.
Yet.
And this time,
oh, I'm sorry.
miracle of miracles, his abused ears converted that little bit of pressure into sound.
Signal the fleet.
Keep going, Aaron.
Overhead, one of the Leviathan gunboats rocked with blows from the guns of one of Togo's destroyers. The skyship careened drunkenly across the sky. Togo raised his binoculars and watched the wounded bird struggle to stay aloft. The Russian commander had divided his fleet, trading a fight against one battleship for a fight against an entire battle fleet. It was a desperate move, one that could only end in the Russians' destruction. Togo shifted his view left and saw the protected cruiser Kasagi, carried by a pair of Russian gunships, turn sharply to port, unmasking her batteries. The Kasagi elevated her guns and fired up. One of the gunships wandered too close to the stream of shells fired from the Kasagi's lethal 8-inch guns. The Berkut shuddered and juked across the sky, rapidly losing altitude. But the second gunship managed to stay out of the Kasagi's line of fire, safely outside the angle to which her guns could elevate. The determined little skyship positioned her guns so her shells fell just beyond her own bow and plunged directly down toward her enemy. The Berkut poured down fire onto the cruiser, accepting the fact that its 3- and 5-inch fire that couldn't penetrate the cruiser's 4-inch armor could handily smash the bridge, kill deckhands. The gunship and the cruiser were tangled together. The Kasagi was like a horse trying to shake off a biting fly. The horse was infinitely more powerful. The fly was almost impossible to catch. Worse, the little Berkut had managed to lure the Kasagi out of the Japanese fleet's battle line. Togo's vessels were being delayed and drawn off, and every second the Baltic fleet survived brought them a second closer to safety. Togo pointed at the cruiser and glanced back at Taniguchi.
Instruct Kasagi to return to her station.
The young officer bobbed his head.
Hi, Togo-sama.
Togo raised his binoculars, watching the cruiser. The gunship fired a volley, and the shells arced harmlessly over the Kasagi's crow's nest. Toys, he thought. Do not bend your will to the makers of toys. The cruiser suddenly turned right. Togo saw the moment when her captain put on the flank bell, the screws churning the water as the Kasagi accelerated to her top speed of 23 knots. She raced back to her position in line, the gunship lobbing shells after her.
Good.
Togo whispered.
Good.
If they kept moving toward the Russian fleet, they could not be denied. The Russian Berkut fired another volley. The Russians could not do Togo's fleet any real harm. They could only win the day if... His breath caught in his throat. Sound like thunder rolled across the water, drowning out the staccato boom of gunfire for several seconds. It was followed by a massive fireball, incandescent orange fire burning to bitter black smoke. The Kasagi served left and then right. There were men running around her deck, some of them on fire, some of them leaping into the sea. The Leviathan had been lucky, smashing a shell into the cruiser's forward magazine and igniting a massive secondary explosion. Except it hadn't been luck. As he examined the scene before him, Togo realized it was a deliberate tactic. The Leviathans were hovering almost directly above his ships, out of reach of his big naval guns, lobbing their shells down. tearing into ship superstructures and stacks, hitting his vessels where their armor was the thinnest. Another peal of thunder rolled across the sea. He turned to see a Japanese torpedo boat pull out of formation, bleeding acrid smoke from her second stack, like a gutted man bleeds dark blood from his belly. Rage took Togo then. Rage, fear. Fortunately, he knew exactly what he had to do.
Ooh. All right, let's switch on over. Wunji, we haven't given you any character dialogue because we ran out of characters. So why don't you take back over our narration?
Right. Like a sea captain who lashes himself to the forward mast in the face of a hurricane, Kozlov clung to his precarious perch on the shattered bridge of the Prince Baratinsky. The storm raged all around him, but he thought he could see the lightening of the clouds that signaled the coming dawn. His skyships were taking the battle to the Japanese. It was nearly impossible for a skyship to deliver a knockout blow to a sea ship, but in this battle, they didn't have to. All they had to do was stay above the enemy's withering fire and keep them occupied. Every minute the Japanese spent swatting at the bees buzzing around their heads brought the Baltic fleet a minute closer to escape. Despite the death and destruction all around him, Kozlov felt a comforting warmth in his chest. He had done the impossible. He had saved the Baltic fleet and preserved his skyships.
Polkovnik,
Said the deck officer. And Kozlov heard it, softly, garbled, and with only one ear, but he heard it.
Deck officer.
The boy was staring at the sea with his binoculars.
Sir, the Mikasa is approaching from the northeast.
Kozlov turned and saw. The Japanese battleship was coming in fast, the ensign at his stern, the rising sun flapping madly in the breeze. The polkovnik raised his binoculars. The Japanese flagship was racing toward his cousin, the battleship Fuji, who was trying vainly to strike back at the Alexander Nevsky, hovering directly overhead. Kozlov saw the danger at once. The Fuji was swerving all over the place, his wake churning a huge swath of ocean, frothy white, turning right and then left, running in a half circle, coming to all stop and drifting, then putting on a quick backing bell with rudder, trying everything to get a clear shot at the Nevsky. But the skyship was more nimble than his opponent. The Nevsky couldn't swoop and glide like a bird, but neither did he have to fight his way through water. The sky cruiser was managing to keep his opponent directly beneath him. Fuji occasionally landed a blow, but the battleship couldn't manage the sustained barrage that would pull Nevsky out of the sky. But if the Mikasa pulled alongside his cousin, his guns would most certainly reach. Quickly, Kozlov tracked his binoculars left to right. Japanese vessels were pulling out of their battle line and forming up into pairs, an arrangement that would enable each ship to elevate his guns enough to strike at their brother's attacker. The quiet sense of victory he had felt now turned to ash. In slowing down the Japanese battle fleet, he had saved the Baltic fleet, and for that, he was about to pay the ultimate price. Kozlov shouted for his signalmen to order the Nevsky to withdraw, but it was already too late.
Keep going.
Disaster had stolen upon Togo with quiet feet. The Baltic fleet had been in his gun sights, literally in his gun sights, and the Leviathans had managed to fling themselves in his path to save their more powerful sisters. For that, they would pay.
Right full rudder.
Ordered Togo into the voice tube, his voice arctic cold.
Steady up on new course 347.
He was coming to a course that paralleled the Fuji. At 5,000 yards abeam of the other battleship, his guns would have sufficient room to target the Nevsky. If he missed, the shells would pass harmlessly over the Fuji, but they would not miss for long. Togo's gunners would find their target quickly and destroy it. And if the skyship tried to run, she would find herself the target of 2 battleships' fire. Togo had not delivered the knockout blow he had planned to the Baltic fleet, but he had crippled Russian power in the Pacific. And now he would finish the world's flirtation with Leviathans with one last devastating blow. He would still have a kind of victory.
We're drawing in range, Togo-sama,
reported Taniguchi.
Aye.
Barked the Admiral. He leaned into the voice tube.
Captain, target the Russian sky cruiser. All port batteries, commence fire.
Hi, Togo-sama.
Answered Mikasa's captain. Shells tore into the cruiser, flaying the light armor from her hull, ripping away the turrets that housed her 3- and 5-inch guns, blasting men off the ship so they fell like pieces of debris. When Togo had been a boy, he'd gone to sea on a whaling ship. What he saw now precisely mimicked the moment when a harpoon plunged into the flesh of one of those great beasts. The sky cruiser lunged right, trying to free itself from its attacker, all the while bleeding black smoke and eteroid like a minke whale, pouring its life into the cruel sea. The Leviathan drifted over the Fuji's center line, then lurched further right, and suddenly the other battleship's guns opened up. The Fuji's frustrated gunners found that the Nevsky had wandered into their gun sights. They poured into her all their rage and hatred. 8 12-inch guns and 12 6-inch guns tore into the staggering Leviathan, and she seemed to just dissolve, her burning carcass plunging toward the sea. A jubilant cheer rose behind Togo, his men jumping up and down and pumping their fists into the air, yelling for all they were worth. And as what was left of the Russian skyship rained down, Togo allowed himself a broad smile.
Eric, why don't you bring us home?
On his crippled bridge, Kozlov watched the Nevsky die. 1 minute the mighty cruiser was there, and the next it was just not. At that moment, Kozlov finally understood the terrible price that he and his men would pay to save the Baltic fleet. He had always understood the price in dry, analytical precincts of his mind, but now he understood it in his gut.
Helm,
Kozlov barked.
come to new course 046. Descend to 100 feet. Lee helm, all ahead flank.
Polkovnik,
Said the deck officer, panic edging his voice.
that will take us.
Do it!
He roared.
All battery crews, stand by your guns.
Stand by your guns. Yes, sir.
Repeated the young deck officer, who now had a life expectancy of between 5 and 10 minutes. If Kozlov was going to be defeated, if his men and ships were going to be destroyed, he was going to take as many as possible of the bastards below with him, starting with that unholy devil, the Mikasa.
Answering all ahead flank, Polkovnik.
Said the lee helm crisply.
Steady on new course 046.
Added the helm.
Very well, gentlemen.
Said Kozlov, folding his arms across his broad chest. He made himself ready to meet his death as the wind howled through the bridge. The Baratinsky lumbered toward the Mikasa to avenge the Alexander Nevsky's death. Togo scanned the horizon and saw the Nevsky's sister turning. She was maybe 12,000 yards to the south-southwest of the Mikasa at an elevation of 200 feet. The Leviathan was wreathed in smoke, and she was burning amidships, a yellow flame throwing a column of black smoke into the blue bowl of the sky. But she was moving. Togo watched her for a second. The Leviathan's squat bow was swinging left. Togo's hand tightened on the binoculars. She was coming left and picking up speed, and descending. Togo dropped his binoculars. The Fuji and the Mikasa were bow on to the skyship. Most of their batteries were masked by the angle of their ships. Togo's mouth suddenly went dry. He felt time and distance ticking away as the Russian skycruiser picked up speed. He leaned into the voice tube.
Captain, forward gun mount, acquire the cruiser. Fire at the cruiser.
The Admiral turned to Taniguchi. The boy was watching the monster as it came for them, watching it with his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with fear.
Lieutenant,
Togo barked.
order the Fuji to come right 90 degrees and bring her portside guns to bear on that skyship.
Taniguchi jerked his head down in rough nod, not even bothering to acknowledge the order. Then he ran back to order the signal himself. The Mikasa's guns opened up. Water exploded 1,000 yards behind the skyship. Togo swallowed. This was not a concern. He had the best gunners afloat. But the Leviathan wasn't exactly afloat, was it? They would lower their elevation. They would find their target. They would pull that obscenity right out of the sky. Togo licked his lips, anticipating the next blast from his forward 12 inchers. Just as the Leviathan came hard right, the shells missed again, this time on range, but wide right. And then the Leviathan's guns opened up. They were not 12-inch naval guns, but they weren't 3- and 5-inch pop guns either. He heard the roar of the cruiser's forward gun mounts and saw white water explode 200 yards aft of the Fuji's stern. The Mikasa answered back. A smoke round traced a neat path over the skyship's bulk. Togo slammed his fist into the compass stand. His gun crews had failed to adjust for the beast's descent. The Leviathan's guns roared again, and this time they hit. Togo saw smoke and fire billow up aft. Suddenly the Fuji was turning.
Taniguchi?
I was Taniguchi.
Oh, what's she doing?
Shouted Taniguchi.
Her rudder's jammed.
Snapped Togo. The Fuji was 4,000 yards away, but she was coming around again. Now she was stern on to the Leviathan, and the monster was still coming. The Leviathan was close enough that Togo could see that her bridge was damaged, the glass shattered, and the window framing bent. He saw a single figure hanging on the framing. He means to kill us, thought Togo.
The Russian.
He whispered.
He's going to ram us.
Togo gave his order.
Come about to a reciprocal course, Captain. Blank bell.
The Leviathan's gun spoke like thunder. It was like thunder, and a second later, Togo heard a terrible cacophony of a hit, felt an explosion rumble through the guts of his flagship. And again, this was not the clank, clank, clank of shells bouncing off his hull. This was the horrible sound of shells punching through 9-inch armor. This was the sound of a mortal blow. He felt his ship, settle down by the bow. The Leviathan was close enough that the Mikasa's forward 6 inchers were joining the 12s, and now the world was nothing but the terrible roar of big guns. It was like being inside thunder. The Mikasa was taking a terrible beating, and so was the Russian sky cruiser. He watched as a Russian 5-inch gun was torn away, and then another. The enemy vessel was shedding armor in huge chunks. It was falling like rain, filling the eye with a gray, gritty haze. The fire he had seen amidships reached out towards 2 more, but the Leviathan kept coming. The skyship's guns fired, and the Mikasa shuddered violently, throwing Togo to the deck, smashing his head against the compass stand. For a moment the world faded to gray. The admiral shook his head, and jagged pain jerked him back. The bodies of his aides were scattered all around him, some of them dead and some of them dying. The heavy metallic stench of blood filled his senses. He no longer found it glorious. The world sloped away from him to the left. The Mikasa had taken a 15-degree list to port. Even as he lay on the deck, he could feel the battleship slipping into the cool embrace of the sea, feel her settling into her destiny. Her guns had fallen silent, pointed down at the sea. She could no longer reach the enemy above. Togo managed to climb to his feet, reached for the voice tube.
Captain.
He croaked. He swallowed.
Strike our colors. Abandon ship.
Aye.
Barked the captain and said no more. This was too painful an order to repeat back. Over Togo's head, the Z flag was burning. He looked up and saw the battered Leviathan claw its way into the blue sky. And at that moment, Admiral Togo Hachiro knew that Japan would not rule the East after all. And he knew one more thing. It was not the age of the gun anymore. It was the age of the sky. It was the age of the Leviathan.
The end. That's a cool story. Wow. Very visual, like you could feel the story unfold in front of you. So that was really awesome. Special thank you to Steve Mohan Jr. For this story, which can be found in the Leviathan's Armored Skies anthology. Yeah, that one that Aaron has there. Aaron, do we have that at cons and stuff?
We do. John brings that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that's available for public release now. This was a lot of fun, guys. Thank you so much.
I want to just give a shout out to Steve Mohan, who we lost late last year. The late Steve Mohan, a great writer for BattleTech, obviously close to my heart with a lot of the work that he gave to us. Bonfire of Worlds, Isle of the Blessed are worth checking out for any BattleTech fans out there who haven't previously caught him. And if the same naval, important to mention, Steve was a 4-year United States Navy officer. He had a deep background in blue water tactics. So
that's awesome.
If that came across in the story, that's why.
That's so cool. Well, thank you all for joining me. You were all real great at this. This was a lot of fun. You know, you never know what kind of readers you're going to get when you pull something together like this. But it was very immersive, very fun. I think it was Jason Hansa that said that Mark needs to be like that late night DJ, DJ After Dark. But thank you guys so much for joining. We are actually going to be back here next week. I haven't decided on a time yet, and I haven't decided on the book, but we're supposed to do a novella for Battletech. So I hope some of you might join me next time, and I hope to see some of you in chat next time. Anything you guys want to say before we say goodnight?
Oh, this was fun. Thank you for pulling it together.
Indeed.
Of course. Thank you
Yeah,
guys.
thanks for setting this up. It's great.
Yeah, I'm thinking while listening to this, I'm getting roped in, and I'm like, could we do a Leviathan short story every week? And I'm like, I need to respect my spell slots. But thank you guys so much for joining me, and thank you all for being here and supporting Leviathans. We're so excited to get this finally fulfilled for the Kickstarter. Quick update there. It's on the boat. Everything's shipping from the manufacturers right now. So we are going to be working, we're finalizing a contract with our distributor, which is supposed to be WebSphere. And then we'll be collecting shipping and hopefully start fulfillment as soon as March, if possible. So pretty exciting to finally get this out into the world and fulfilled, and then to retail. So hooray, Leviathans! This is the year of Leviathans, finally. But thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Right.